What kind of military sends a translator into combat and then forbids him from translating? The question seemed absurd until you understood the logic behind it, a logic built on fear rather than strategy, on statistics rather than battlefield reality. Somewhere in the chaos of the largest amphibious invasion since Normandy, one soldier carried a skill that could save lives, and his commanding officers had made it a crime for him to use it. The policy had been typed on official letterhead, distributed with the weight of regulation, justified with incident reports and casualty numbers. But policies written in safe headquarters rarely survive contact with the moment when silence becomes complicity, when following orders means watching men die for reasons that made perfect sense 2,000 miles away and no sense at all when the bullets started flying. The summer of 1950 had transformed the Korean peninsula into a slaughterhouse that caught American military leadership completely unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the North Korean invasion that crossed the 38th parallel on June 25th, with 135,000 troops and over 150 Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks against a South Korean force that possessed no tanks, no anti-tank weapons, and minimal combat training. Galvin Hill had watched the disaster unfold from his barracks at Fort Lewis in Washington State, where he served with the 7th Infantry Division as a rifleman despite scoring the highest marks in Korean language proficiency during his advanced training at the Presidio of San Francisco, a skill the Army seemed desperate to utilize one moment and terrified to acknowledge the next. His father had emigrated from Korea to California in 1923, building a successful import business in Los Angeles before relocating the family to Seattle in 1941 to escape the increasing harassment of Asian Americans on the West Coast, though that decision proved futile when Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced removal of Japanese Americans to internment camps, and the atmosphere of suspicion extended to all Asian families, regardless of their actual nationality or demonstrated loyalty to the United States. Hill had enlisted in 1948 at age 19, motivated partly by a desire to prove his family's American loyalty, and partly by the practical reality that military service offered better opportunities than the limited options available to Korean Americans in post-war Seattle, where discrimination in housing and employment remained pervasive despite the recent Allied victory over fascism that had supposedly been fought to defend democratic values and human dignity. The Army had seized upon his language skills immediately, rushing him through an intensive program at the Presidio where he studied military terminology, tactical communications, and the regional dialects spoken across the Korean peninsula, training that consumed 8 months of grueling 14-hour days, studying under native Korean instructors who had fled the communist north and who impressed upon their students the critical importance of precise translation in combat situations where a single misunderstood word could mean the difference between coordinated assault and catastrophic friendly fire. But something had changed in the chaotic months after North Korea's invasion, as American forces rushed to defend the collapsing Pusan perimeter, and commanders reported increasing incidents of troops firing on South Korean civilians and Allied soldiers, because they could not distinguish friend from foe in the confusion of fluid combat across unfamiliar terrain, where everyone looked Asian and spoke languages that sounded identical to untrained American ears. The policy memorandum had arrived on August 10th, distributed throughout the 7th Infantry Division with stark clarity that left no room for interpretation or individual judgment. All personnel with Korean language skills were prohibited from speaking Korean in operational environments unless specifically directed by an officer of captain rank or higher, and even then, only in controlled situations with proper identification protocols established in advance. The reasoning cited 3 friendly fire incidents in July, where American units had killed South Korean army soldiers after hearing Korean being spoken and assuming enemy presence, plus 2 cases where North Korean infiltrators had successfully penetrated American lines by speaking limited English and exploiting the confusion of battle. Division Command determined that the risk of additional friendly fire incidents outweighed the potential intelligence benefits of Korean-speaking American soldiers, and therefore all such personnel would function exclusively as riflemen until clearer battlefield conditions allowed for safer utilization of their linguistic capabilities. Hill had read the memorandum 3 times, searching for some exception or clarification that might acknowledge the absurdity of deploying Korean speakers to Korea and then forbidding them from speaking Korean, but the policy remained absolute and unambiguous. The landing craft carrying 1st Platoon, Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 32nd Infantry Regiment approached Inchon's Red Beach at 0630 hours on September 15, 1950, navigating through the narrow channel that General Douglas MacArthur had insisted remained the key to cutting North Korean supply lines despite Navy objections about the extreme tidal variations that created a 30-foot difference between high and low tide and left only brief windows for amphibious operations. Hill crouched among 34 other soldiers in the Higgins boat, checking his M1 Garand rifle for the 5th time, while Lieutenant Morrison shouted last-minute reminders about maintaining unit cohesion during the chaotic beach assault and securing the immediate beachhead before pushing inland toward the day's primary objective of securing Inchon's port facilities. The air smelled of diesel fuel, salt water, and the acrid smoke from naval bombardment that had pounded the beaches for the past 2 hours, creating a haze that reduced visibility to less than 200 yards and turned the early morning sunlight into a sickly orange glow that barely penetrated the clouds of dust and burning debris. The ramp dropped at 0633, and 1st Platoon surged forward into waist-deep water that proved colder than anyone had anticipated despite the September warmth, immediately spreading out to reduce casualties from the expected machine gun fire that intelligence reports had predicted would meet them on the beach. But the beach lay strangely quiet, except for the distant crackle of small arms fire from the northern section of Red Beach, where 3rd Battalion had encountered actual resistance, and the anticipated North Korean defensive positions appeared to have been abandoned or destroyed during the naval bombardment that had systematically targeted every visible structure along the waterfront. Morrison rallied the platoon at a damaged seawall, accounting for all 35 men, and confirming 0 casualties during the landing, then ordered an immediate push inland toward the Port Warehouse district, where intelligence suggested North Korean forces might have consolidated after withdrawing from the exposed beach positions. 1st Platoon advanced 3 blocks inland through narrow streets littered with rubble from the bombardment, passing abandoned shops and damaged homes that showed no signs of civilian presence. No North Korean soldiers, no South Korean civilians, no movement except smoke drifting from burning buildings and papers scattering in the morning breeze. Morrison halted the platoon at an intersection near the warehouse district, consulting his tactical map, while Sergeant Hayes established a defensive perimeter. Hill noticed them first. 3 Korean civilians, 2 men and 1 elderly woman, emerging from a partially collapsed building 200 feet to the east. They saw the American troops and began running toward them, shouting frantically and gesturing toward the warehouse complex ahead, shouting in Korean, warning about something urgent, something dangerous waiting in those warehouses. Hill understood every word they screamed. Enemy soldiers, hundreds of them, hidden in the port warehouses, waiting to ambush American forces. The woman kept pointing at a specific warehouse with red doors, repeating numbers in Korean. 300 soldiers, 300 North Korean troops with machine guns and mortars, positioned to turn the warehouse district into a killing zone. Lieutenant Morrison stared at the approaching civilians with confusion and growing alarm, unable to understand their desperate warnings. He raised his hand to halt their approach, barking questions in English that they could not comprehend. Sergeant Hayes stepped forward, rifle raised, shouting for them to stop advancing, or he would open fire because they might be North Korean infiltrators or suicide bombers attempting to get close to American troops. The three civilians froze, still shouting their warnings, begging the Americans to understand the immediate danger waiting 2 blocks ahead. Hill's throat tightened. His hands gripped his rifle. The regulation memorandum burned in his memory. Do not speak Korean, under any circumstances, unless ordered by a captain or higher. Lieutenant Morrison was only a lieutenant. First Platoon had no captain present. The policy was absolute. Hill remained silent while the 3 South Korean civilians screamed their warnings into the indifferent morning air, and First Platoon prepared to march directly into an ambush that would kill 19 American soldiers in the next 11 minutes. Lieutenant Morrison made the decision that regulations demanded and that tactical doctrine supported when encountering unknown civilians in a hostile urban environment where North Korean infiltrators had already demonstrated their willingness to exploit American confusion and goodwill. He ordered the 3 South Koreans to move away from First Platoon's position immediately, gesturing forcefully toward a side street, while Sergeant Hayes kept his rifle trained on them in case they made any sudden movements that might indicate hostile intent. And when the elderly woman continued to approach, while shouting and gesturing frantically toward the warehouse district, Morrison fired a warning shot into the rubble near her feet that sent all 3 civilians scrambling back into the damaged building from which they had emerged. The lieutenant turned to his platoon with visible frustration, announcing that they would proceed with the original mission objective of securing the port warehouses and that all personnel should maintain heightened vigilance for civilian infiltrators who might be working with North Korean forces to identify American positions or lure troops into prepared ambush sites. Hill felt the weight of his M1 Garand increase in his hands, felt the Korean words pressing against his teeth like physical objects demanding release, felt the absolute clarity of the regulation memorandum that had anticipated exactly this scenario and had determined that the risk of friendly fire exceeded the potential value of translation services in ambiguous tactical situations. The warehouse district occupied 6 city blocks of industrial structures built during the Japanese colonial period, massive concrete and steel buildings designed to handle the bulk cargo that moved through Inchon's port during the years when Korea served as a critical supply hub for Japan's expansion into Manchuria and later into China proper during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Most warehouses stood 3 stories tall with reinforced walls that had survived the morning's naval bombardment with minimal damage, creating perfect defensive positions for any force that recognized the tactical value of high ground and protected firing positions, overlooking the narrow streets that formed natural choke points between the buildings. Intelligence reports had suggested that North Korean forces in Inchon numbered approximately 2,000 troops scattered throughout the city, with the majority concentrated around the port facilities that represented the most valuable military asset in the region. But those same reports had predicted much stronger resistance on the beaches rather than the abandoned positions that First Platoon had encountered during their unopposed landing 30 minutes earlier. Morrison organized First Platoon into 2 squads for the advance into the warehouse district, with First Squad, under Sergeant Hayes, taking the western approach along the waterfront road, while Second Squad, under Corporal Bennett, moved through the parallel street 1 block inland, both squads maintaining visual contact through the gaps between warehouses and coordinating their advance to reach the large central warehouse with red doors that dominated the district's main intersection. The tactical plan reflected standard doctrine for urban combat in potentially hostile territory. emphasizing mutual support between squads and maintaining multiple avenues of retreat if the advance encountered unexpected resistance, and Morrison specifically ordered both squad leaders to avoid entering any warehouse structures until engineers could sweep for booby traps and structural damage that might cause collapse under the weight of armed troops. Hill moved with second squad, positioned near the middle of the formation where his rifle would be most effective if contact occurred from either front or rear, constantly scanning the warehouse windows and rooftops for any sign of enemy presence while trying to ignore the memory of 3 desperate South Korean civilians who had risked their lives to deliver a warning that no American could understand. First Squad reached the intersection at 0644 without encountering any resistance, and Sergeant Hayes radioed Morrison to report the area appeared clear, with no visible enemy activity anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Second Squad arrived at the intersection from the eastern approach 17 seconds later, and Corporal Bennett confirmed Hayes' assessment that the warehouse district showed no signs of North Korean presence, despite intelligence predictions to the contrary. Morrison consulted his tactical map briefly before ordering both squads to establish a defensive perimeter around the central warehouse with red doors, while he radioed battalion headquarters to report successful penetration of the warehouse district and request further orders regarding the next phase of securing Inchon's port facilities. The 35 men of First Platoon spread out around the intersection, taking cover behind damaged vehicles and rubble piles while maintaining overlapping fields of fire that could suppress any enemy attempt to counterattack their position. The machine gun fire erupted from 6 different windows simultaneously at 0646, catching First Platoon in a crossfire that killed 4 men in the initial 3-second burst and wounded 7 more before anyone could react or identify the source of incoming rounds. Hayes went down immediately, with bullets through his chest and throat, dead before his body hit the pavement, and Bennett took rounds through both legs that shattered his femurs and left him screaming on the street while his squad scattered for any available cover in the intersection that offered no adequate protection from elevated firing positions. Morrison attempted to organize a coordinated response, but discovered that the North Korean machine gunners had positioned themselves to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to the warehouses and every piece of cover in the intersection, effectively pinning the entire platoon in a kill zone, with no protected route of withdrawal back toward the beach. Hill threw himself behind a destroyed truck chassis, feeling bullets punch through the thin metal inches from his head. The firing came from the Red Door warehouse, 2nd-floor windows, 3rd-floor windows, exactly where the South Korean woman had pointed, exactly what she had warned them about. 300 North Korean soldiers, 300 enemy troops who had withdrawn from the beach defenses to create this perfect ambush in the urban terrain, where their defensive advantages multiplied against an American force that had expected minimal resistance. Morrison was shouting into his radio for artillery support, for naval gunfire, for any supporting fires that could suppress the machine gun positions long enough for First Platoon to withdraw from the kill zone. But fire support required coordinates, required spotters, required time that First Platoon did not possess, while men died every 15 seconds under the methodical fire discipline of well-trained North Korean gunners who understood their tactical advantage and intended to exploit it completely. Private Williams died trying to drag Bennett to cover. Private Jackson died returning fire at a muzzle flash. Private Rodriguez died when he stood to throw a grenade. The intersection filled with smoke and blood and the screams of wounded men who could not be reached without dying in the attempt. Morrison took a round through his shoulder that spun him around and dropped him behind a pile of concrete rubble, leaving First Platoon without effective command and without any clear path to survival. Hill pressed himself against the truck chassis, his mind calculating angles and distances and tactical options with the cold precision that fear produces in trained soldiers who understand they are about to die. He could see the muzzle flashes from the warehouse windows, could identify the coordinated fire patterns that indicated professional military training rather than hasty defensive positions, could recognize the systematic nature of an ambush that had been carefully prepared and patiently executed against an American force that had walked into the trap exactly as predicted. 19 men dead or dying in 11 minutes. Because 3 South Korean civilians could not make themselves understood, because 1 American soldier had followed regulations instead of conscience, because a policy memorandum written in Washington had determined that friendly fire prevention justified any other cost. The mathematics of survival in urban combat follow brutal simplicity that reduces tactical doctrine to a single calculation of angles, cover, and the willingness to move when every instinct screams to remain frozen in whatever protection currently keeps you alive. Hill understood that First Platoon would die completely in the next 5 minutes unless someone broke the paralysis that had transformed 35 trained soldiers into 35 separate individuals concerned only with their own immediate survival. Each man pressed against whatever rubble or vehicle or concrete fragment offered momentary shelter from the machine gun fire that continued to sweep the intersection with methodical precision. Morrison lay 30 feet away behind a pile of shattered masonry, clutching his shattered shoulder while trying unsuccessfully to raise battalion on the radio that had taken shrapnel during the initial burst and now produced only static and the occasional fragment of transmission too garbled to provide useful communication with supporting units. The North Korean gunners had stopped their sustained fire after the first devastating minute, switching to a patient marksmanship approach that conserved ammunition while preventing any American attempt to organize a coordinated withdrawal or counterattack. And Hill recognized the tactical shift as evidence of professional military training rather than the desperate defensive posture of cornered troops fighting without hope of survival or reinforcement. The warehouse with red doors dominated the intersection from its position on the northeastern corner, a 3-story structure built during the Japanese colonial period with reinforced concrete walls thick enough to stop rifle fire and narrow windows positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across every approach to the building. Hill counted 6 active machine gun positions spread across the 2nd and 3rd floors, with additional riflemen visible in windows that covered the gaps between the heavy weapons, creating a defensive network that reflected careful planning and rehearsal rather than hasty improvisation in response to the American landing. The North Korean commander had anticipated exactly this approach route, had positioned his forces to maximize the natural advantages of the urban terrain, and had demonstrated the fire discipline necessary to avoid revealing his positions prematurely during First Platoon's advance through the warehouse district. The civilians had tried to prevent this massacre, had risked their lives running toward American troops while shouting warnings about the trap waiting ahead. And Lieutenant Morrison had done exactly what regulations and tactical doctrine demanded when encountering unknown civilians in a combat zone, by treating them as potential threats rather than potential allies whose information might prove more valuable than caution. Hill had joined the army to prove something about loyalty and belonging, concepts that seemed straightforward when discussed in recruiting offices or high school civics classes, but that revealed their complexity when filtered through the reality of regulations written by officers who would never experience the consequences of their policies. His father had built a successful business through decades of patient work and careful navigation of the racism that defined American society's treatment of Asian immigrants, teaching his son that survival required demonstrating value that exceeded the cost of prejudice, that acceptance came through making yourself indispensable rather than demanding recognition of basic human dignity. The internment camps had shattered that illusion for many Japanese American families who discovered that decades of loyalty and contribution meant nothing when fear and racial hostility provided sufficient justification for imprisonment without trial or evidence of actual wrongdoing. Korean Americans had escaped that particular horror through the accident of their ethnicity. But Hill understood that the same logic could be applied to any Asian population when circumstances made suspicion seem more prudent than justice. The language policy represented that same calculation dressed in tactical language, the determination that preventing friendly fire incidents justified any other cost, including the deaths that would result from Americans being unable to communicate with the Korean population they had supposedly come to defend. Private Chen died while Hill calculated these abstract questions of policy and identity. The bullet caught Chen in the head while he attempted to low-crawl from his exposed position near the center of the intersection to better cover behind a destroyed vehicle, and his body jerked once before going still in the spreading pool of blood that mixed with the dust and debris covering the street. Hill watched Chen die and understood with perfect clarity that abstract questions meant nothing when measured against the simple fact of a 20-year-old kid from San Francisco who would never go home because a policy memorandum had determined that language barriers represented acceptable casualties in the larger strategy of preventing friendly fire. Morrison had stopped trying to use the radio and now simply pressed both hands against his wounded shoulder, while his face turned the pale grey colour that indicated shock and significant blood loss. Corporal Davis attempted to reach Morrison's position to provide medical assistance, but took fire immediately that forced him back behind cover. First Platoon had ceased to function as a coherent military unit and had devolved into a scattered collection of terrified individuals waiting to die. Hill made the decision in the space between heartbeats, in that moment of absolute clarity when survival instinct overrides training and regulation and reasonable caution. He rose from behind the truck chassis with his hands raised high above his head, his M1 Garand left on the ground behind him, and walked directly into the intersection toward the warehouse with red doors while shouting in Korean at the top of his lungs, announcing American surrender, requesting ceasefire to recover wounded, identifying himself as a translator attached to First Platoon with authority to negotiate under flag of truce. The words poured out in the formal dialect he had learned at the Presidio from instructors who had emphasized the critical importance of proper protocol when communicating across military hierarchies, and Hill kept his hands visible and his movements slow while crossing the 20 feet of open ground that separated temporary cover from the warehouse entrance. The machine gun fire stopped completely. Silence filled the intersection, except for the moans of wounded Americans and the distant rumble of naval bombardment targeting other sections of Inchon. A voice responded in Korean from a second-floor window of the warehouse, demanding identification and proof of authority to negotiate surrender. Hill answered in the same formal dialect, providing his name, rank, unit designation, and the information that Lieutenant Morrison had been incapacitated by wounds, and that First Platoon required immediate medical assistance for multiple casualties. The voice questioned his Korean proficiency, suspicious that an American soldier could speak with such fluency and proper grammar. Hill explained his father's immigration, his training at the Presidio, the irony that the American army had forbidden him from using the skill they had spent 8 months teaching him. The voice laughed, a sound without humor that acknowledged the absurdity they both recognized. A North Korean officer emerged from the warehouse entrance, a captain based on the insignia visible on his torn and blood-stained uniform, flanked by 2 soldiers with rifles trained on Hill's chest. The captain spoke quickly, asking direct questions about American force strength, artillery support, and naval assets available for fire missions. Hill answered with the minimum information necessary to establish credibility, while providing nothing that might endanger other American units advancing through Inchon. The captain nodded slowly, evaluating Hill's responses and his demeanor, then issued orders to his men that resulted in the machine guns being pulled back from the windows and the riflemen lowering their weapons. He turned back to Hill with an expression that mixed exhaustion, pain, and a kind of resigned professionalism that transcended the ideological divide between their uniforms. His next words came in careful English, heavily accented but grammatically precise. He would accept American surrender and allow medical evacuation of the wounded, but there was something Hill needed to see first. Something in the warehouse basement, something that explained why 300 North Korean soldiers had chosen to die defending this particular building, rather than withdrawing to more defensible positions in the hills outside Inchon. The captain gestured toward the warehouse entrance. After Hill saw what they were protecting, he would understand why this ambush had been inevitable, why the civilians had risked everything to warn the Americans, why silence had killed 19 men who might have lived if one soldier had broken a regulation written by officers who would never face the consequences of their policies. The warehouse basement stretched 40 feet in each direction, a concrete cavity designed for cold storage during the Japanese colonial period, when Inchon served as a critical transshipment point for resources extracted from Korea and destined for Japanese industrial centers in Osaka and Tokyo. But the space no longer held fish or grain or manufactured goods awaiting export across the Sea of Japan. Instead, the basement contained something worth dying for, worth sacrificing 300 North Korean soldiers in a defensive position that offered no hope of survival once American naval gunfire and artillery located the source of resistance. Hill descended the wooden stairs behind the North Korean captain, his eyes adjusting to the dim light provided by a single kerosene lamp hanging from a ceiling beam, and immediately understood why the civilians had risked everything to warn First Platoon about the trap waiting in the warehouse district. Spread across 3 improvised tables constructed from wooden crates sat the complete operational maps for North Korean defensive positions throughout Inchon and the surrounding countryside, detailed documents showing troop concentrations, supply caches, communication networks, and fallback positions that would be activated as American forces pushed inland from the beachhead. But the maps represented only half of what the basement contained, only half of what the North Korean captain and his men had been protecting with their lives. 47 South Korean civilians huddled against the far wall of the basement, bound with rope and guarded by 2 North Korean soldiers who kept their rifles trained on the prisoners, even as their captain negotiated surrender with an American translator in the warehouse above. The civilians ranged from elderly men and women to children as young as 6 or 7 years old, all showing signs of malnutrition and abuse that indicated weeks or months of captivity rather than hours, all watching Hill with expressions that mixed desperate hope with the kind of exhaustion that comes from believing rescue will never arrive. The North Korean captain explained in Korean that these people represented the families of South Korean government officials and military officers who had fled Inchon during the initial invasion in June. Hostages held to ensure cooperation from local leaders who might otherwise organize resistance against the occupation forces. When the American invasion began, a North Korean command recognized that Inchon could not be held against MacArthur's overwhelming naval and air superiority. They had ordered the execution of all hostages to prevent their liberation and the intelligence they possessed about North Korean operations throughout the occupied territories. But the captain and his men had refused that order, choosing instead to defend this warehouse with the knowledge that they would almost certainly die, but that their sacrifice might delay American forces long enough for the hostages to be evacuated north, or at minimum to ensure that the operational maps were destroyed before capture. The captain spoke with the calm precision of a man who had made peace with death and who now simply wanted someone to understand the choices that had led to this moment. The calculation that weighing the lives of 300 North Korean soldiers against 47 South Korean civilians somehow balanced in favor of the hostages, even though tactical doctrine and orders from command demanded their execution. He had graduated from Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang in 1947 with a degree in engineering, had believed in the promise of socialist reconstruction that would lift Korea from the poverty and humiliation of Japanese colonialism, had watched that promise degrade into the same authoritarian brutality it claimed to oppose when the leadership prioritized ideology over basic human dignity. The invasion of South Korea had been sold as liberation, as reunification of a divided peninsula. But the reality on the ground revealed itself in the execution orders for civilians whose only crime was having family members on the wrong side of an arbitrary line drawn by foreign powers who understood nothing about Korean history or culture. So when the order came to kill the hostages, the captain had instead chosen to position his men in this warehouse, with the operational maps and the civilians, gambling that American forces would capture both before North Korean command could organize a relief column or bombing raid to destroy the evidence of his disobedience. Hill absorbed this information while calculating the immediate tactical implications that transformed everything about First Platoon's situation in the intersection above. The operational maps represented intelligence value that exceeded any individual engagement, information that could save hundreds or thousands of American lives as the invasion pushed inland from Inchon towards Seoul and beyond. The hostages provided immediate propaganda value and humanitarian justification for the entire operation. Proof that North Korean forces were not simply defending their territory, but actively terrorizing civilian populations. And the North Korean captain's willingness to surrender his entire force in exchange for safe passage for the hostages demonstrated a crack in the ideological certainty that American intelligence had assumed characterized all communist military forces. Hill asked about the 3 civilians who had attempted to warn First Platoon, and the captain confirmed they were family members of hostages being held in the basement, local residents who had tracked the prisoners' location and who had risked execution by approaching American troops, despite knowing that language barriers would make communication nearly impossible. The medical evacuation proceeded with surprising efficiency once Hill translated the captain's surrender terms to the surviving members of First Platoon and established radio contact with battalion headquarters using the North Korean captain's functioning equipment. Navy corpsmen reached the intersection within 15 minutes, triaging the wounded and establishing casualty collection points, while combat engineers secured the warehouse and began the careful process of documenting the operational maps before transporting them to division intelligence for analysis. The hostages emerged from the basement, blinking in the morning sunlight, many too weak to walk unassisted, all overcome by the sudden reversal of fortune that had transformed them from condemned prisoners to liberated civilians in the span of 30 minutes. The 3 civilians who had attempted to warn First Platoon found their family members among the hostages, reunions that played out with the quiet intensity of people who had believed they would never see each other again. 13 members of First Platoon were dead, including Sergeant Hayes. 6 more would die from their wounds before reaching the hospital ship offshore, and the intersection remained littered with the equipment and blood that marked the cost of an ambush that could have been avoided if one soldier had been permitted to speak Korean when it mattered most. Lieutenant Morrison survived his shoulder wound and spent 4 days in field surgery before being evacuated to Japan for further treatment. He never filed charges against Hill for violating the language policy, never mentioned the regulation memorandum in his after-action report, never acknowledged that 19 American soldiers had died because regulations prevented communication with civilians who possessed critical intelligence about enemy positions. Hill received a Bronze Star for his actions in negotiating the surrender and securing the operational maps, a commendation that carefully avoided mentioning the specific regulation he had violated or the context that had made that violation necessary. The intelligence gathered from the warehouse basement contributed to the rapid American advance from Inchon to Seoul, helping identify North Korean defensive positions and supply routes that allowed MacArthur's forces to minimize casualties during the liberation of South Korea's capital city. Division Command revised the language policy in October 1950, authorizing Korean-speaking personnel to provide translation services in operational environments under less restrictive conditions, though the new policy included no acknowledgement that the previous regulations had contributed to preventable American casualties. Calvin Hill served another 2 years in Korea, working as a translator and liaison officer with South Korean military units and civilian authorities. He thought often about the 3 civilians who had tried to warn First Platoon about the North Korean captain who had chosen mercy over ideology, about the 19 men who died in an intersection because someone in a headquarters 2,000 miles away had decided that preventing friendly fire justified any other cost. The mathematics seemed simple in retrospect. If he had spoken Korean when the civilians first approached, First Platoon would have avoided the ambush completely. If the language policy had permitted translation services in tactical situations, hundreds of American soldiers might have survived encounters where communication could have replaced combat. But policies are not revised based on hypothetical calculations or individual tragedies. They are revised based on accumulating evidence that becomes impossible to ignore, based on enough deaths that even headquarters staff must acknowledge that their regulations produce consequences more dangerous than the risks those regulations were designed to prevent. Hill had broken the regulation and saved lives by doing so. The Army gave him a medal and changed the policy. 19 families received folded flags and telegrams explaining that their sons had died honorably in service to their country. None of those telegrams mentioned that their deaths had been preventable. None of those families would ever know that a policy memorandum written in August had killed their loved ones in September. The mathematics of that silence would never balance, no matter how many medals were awarded, or policies revised, or battles won in the months and years that followed the Inchon landing.